37 years have passed, and I still hear that door creaking open. Every morning when I make my coffee in this same kitchen, I look down that hallway and I remember the day my heart broke in a way I never knew was possible. My name is Dorothy Mae Thompson, I'm 81 years old, and I've been carrying a secret that's heavier than any burden a mother should bear. People always tell you that time heals all wounds, that eventually the pain fades and life moves on. Well, let me tell you something, they never caught their own son in bed with his wife. They never had to choose between destroying an entire family or carrying hell inside their chest for the rest of their lives. This ring on my finger, I've been turning it for 37 years every time I think about that summer day in 1987. I was 54 then, a widow who thought she'd already paid her dues to heartbreak when the army came to tell me my husband wasn't coming home from Vietnam. I raised my boy Michael all by myself, gave him everything I had, every piece of my soul went into making sure he became a good man. And for years, I thought I'd succeeded. He married sweet Sarah, gave me 2 beautiful grandchildren, and we were a family. A real family. But sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who can hurt you in ways you never saw coming. Cedar Falls, Kentucky wasn't much to look at, just a small town where everybody knew everybody's business, and that suited me just fine back in 1987. I'd been living in the same 2-story house on Maple Street for 23 years, ever since Michael was just a little boy running around in diapers, asking when his daddy was coming home. James never did come home from Vietnam. He left when Michael was 2, promised he'd be back for Christmas, and all I got back was a folded flag and a letter that said he died serving his country. So there I was, 27 years old with a toddler and a mortgage, working double shifts at the textile factory just to keep food on the table and shoes on Michael's feet. But you know what? I didn't mind. That boy became my whole world, my reason for getting up every morning and pushing through another day. I used to sit on this same front porch after my shifts, watching him play in the yard, and I'd think to myself that maybe God took his father so early because he knew I had enough love in me for both parents. Michael grew up good, real good. He was the kind of son who'd bring me flowers he picked from Mrs. Henderson's garden, who'd help me carry groceries without being asked, who'd sit with me on Sunday evenings and tell me about his dreams. He wanted to be a mechanic, fix cars like his daddy used to do before the war, and by God, he did it. Opened up his own little shop right here in town when he turned 25. That's where he met Sarah. She came in one day with her daddy's old Buick making this terrible noise, and Michael fixed it for half the price anyone else would have charged. Sweet girl, Sarah was. Blonde hair always in a ponytail, prettiest blue eyes you ever saw, and she had this laugh that could light up a room. When Michael brought her home for Sunday dinner the first time, I knew she was the one. The way she looked at him, the way she helped me clear the table without being asked, the way she listened when I told stories about Michael as a little boy. They got married in the spring of 1982, right here in our little Baptist church, and I cried harder than I did at my own wedding. Happy tears, mind you. I was so proud watching my boy promise to love and honor this woman, knowing I'd raised him right, knowing he understood what it meant to be a good husband. And then came the babies. Little Tommy in 1983, just the spitting image of his daddy with those dark eyes and stubborn chin. Then Katie in 1985, sweet as pie with Sarah's blonde curls and my own green eyes. Lord, how I loved those babies. They'd spend weekends at Grandma's house, and I'd spoil them rotten with homemade cookies and bedtime stories. Michael would joke that they loved me more than their own parents, and maybe they did. I didn't mind. After all those years of being alone, of coming home to an empty house and eating dinner by myself, suddenly I had this beautiful family filling up every corner of my life. Sunday dinners were the best part of my week. All of us gathered around my old dining room table, Michael carving the roast while Sarah helped me bring out the sides, Tommy and Katie chattering about school and friends and whatever cartoon they'd watched that morning. We looked like something out of a magazine, like one of those perfect families you see in church newsletters. Michael had built a good life, steady work, a loving wife, healthy children, and respect in the community. Sarah was happy too, always humming while she washed dishes, always planning little trips to the lake or picnics in the park. And me? Well, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. After losing James, after all those years of struggle and loneliness, I finally had everything I'd ever wanted. My son was successful, my daughter-in-law was like the daughter I never had, and my grandchildren were the light of my life. I used to thank God every night for giving me such blessings, for letting me live to see my boy become a man I could be proud of. That summer of 1987 started just like every other summer. Michael's shop was busy, Sarah was planning Katie's 3rd birthday party, and I was looking forward to a week at the lake with all of them in August. If someone had told me that in a few short weeks my whole world would come crashing down, that I'd discover something so terrible it would change everything I thought I knew about my own family, I would have laughed in their face. But that's the thing about betrayal, isn't it? It always comes from the people you trust the most, the ones you never see coming. You have to understand something about me to understand why what happened next destroyed me so completely. Being Michael's mother wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. From the moment the doctor placed that baby in my arms at Cedar Falls General Hospital, every breath I took, every decision I made, every dream I had was about him. When other women my age were thinking about careers or traveling or finding new husbands after they lost theirs, I was thinking about Michael. How to make his lunches more interesting, how to help him with his homework, how to save enough money for the baseball glove he wanted for Christmas. I gave everything to that boy, and I mean everything. There were nights I'd eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so he could have a proper meal with meat and vegetables. There were times I wore the same dress to church for months because Michael needed new school clothes. I worked myself to the bone at that textile factory, standing on my feet for 12 hours straight, breathing in lint and chemicals, just so I could give him the childhood his father's death had tried to steal from him. And you know what? I was proud of every sacrifice. Every single one. When other mothers complained about how hard it was to raise children, I'd just smile and nod, but inside I was thinking that they didn't know what hard was. They had husbands to help them, to share the load. They had someone to talk to when the kids were driving them crazy, someone to make decisions with, someone to hold them when they cried from exhaustion. I had me, myself, and somehow I made it work. I made it more than work, I made it beautiful. Michael never went to bed hungry, never went to school dirty, never felt unloved for even a single day of his life. I was there for every scraped knee, every bad dream, every disappointment. I cheered at every little league game, helped with every school project, attended every parent-teacher conference with a smile on my face and pride in my heart. When he graduated high school, when he opened his shop, when he married Sarah, when he became a father himself, I felt like I was watching my life's greatest masterpiece come to completion. This wasn't just about raising a child, this was about proving that a woman alone could do what 2 parents were supposed to do. This was about showing the world that love could overcome anything, that dedication could triumph over circumstances, that a mother's heart was strong enough to fill every empty space left by tragedy. I used to look at Michael and think that James would be so proud if he could see what his son had become. I used to imagine telling my husband all about it when I joined him in heaven someday, how I'd kept my promise to raise his boy right, how I'd turned our baby into a man any father would be honored to claim. My identity, my self-worth, my entire sense of purpose was wrapped up in being Michael's mother. When people in town talked about me, they didn't say, "There goes Dorothy Thompson, the widow," or "There goes Dorothy Thompson, the factory worker." They said, "There goes Dorothy Thompson, you know, Michael's mother. That woman raised him all by herself after her husband died in Vietnam. Did a fine job too." That's how I wanted to be remembered, that's how I saw myself. I was the woman who loved her son so much that nothing else mattered, who sacrificed everything to give him the best life possible, who succeeded in raising a good man despite all the odds against us. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a woman who'd been dealt a hard hand by life. I saw a mother who'd done her job and done it well. I saw someone who'd turned tragedy into triumph, who'd created something beautiful out of something broken. Every gray hair on my head, every line on my face, every ache in my back from all those years of hard work, they were all badges of honor. They were proof that I'd given everything I had to give, and it had been enough. It had been more than enough. So when I tell you that what I saw that day didn't just break my heart, when I tell you it shattered everything I thought I knew about myself and my life, you'll understand why. Because it wasn't just my son who betrayed me that day. It was everything I'd built my entire existence around. Everything I'd believed about love, about family, about the power of a mother's devotion to shape a child's character. In one terrible moment, 37 years of believing I'd done everything right came crashing down around me. It was a Sunday in July, hot and humid like only Kentucky summers can be, the kind of day where the air sits heavy on your chest and even the slightest breeze feels like a blessing from above. I remember every detail about that morning because it was the last morning of my old life, the last time I'd wake up as the woman I thought I was. I'd gotten dressed for church in my pale blue dress, the one with the tiny flowers that Sarah always said brought out my eyes, and I'd driven to First Baptist just like I had every Sunday for the past 25 years. Pastor Williams was preaching about forgiveness that day, about how we're called to forgive others as God forgives us, and I sat in my usual pew third row from the front, nodding along and thinking about how blessed I was to have such a good family, such a peaceful life. But halfway through the service, this terrible headache started creeping up the back of my neck, one of those pounding headaches that makes your vision blur and your stomach turn. I tried to tough it out, tried to focus on the sermon, but it just kept getting worse until I could barely see straight. Mrs. Patterson, who sat next to me, kept asking if I was all right, and finally I had to admit defeat. I whispered to her that I needed to go home and lie down, gathered up my purse and my Bible, and slipped out the back during the final hymn. The drive home felt longer than usual, probably because I was dreading having to tell Michael and Sarah that I wouldn't be able to make Sunday dinner. They were supposed to come over around 1 o'clock with the kids, and I had a roast in the slow cooker that had been cooking since early morning. I figured Michael could take it home with them, and I'd just spend the afternoon in bed with a cold cloth on my forehead until this headache passed. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that Michael's truck was already there, parked right behind Sarah's little Honda. That struck me as odd because they weren't supposed to be there for another hour and a half, but I figured maybe they'd decided to come early to help me finish cooking, or maybe the kids had been restless and they needed somewhere for them to run around. I didn't see Tommy and Katie playing in the yard though, which was strange because those children never sat still for 5 minutes when they were at Grandma's house. The house was completely quiet when I walked in through the front door, which should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. Usually when the whole family was here, you could hear them from the street. Tommy would be running around making car noises or airplane sounds, Katie would be chattering away about something, Sarah would be laughing at whatever story Michael was telling, and Michael would be calling out to me the minute he heard my key in the lock. But this silence was different, heavy, and strange, like the air before a thunderstorm. I called out, "Hello, anybody home?" but nobody answered. I checked the living room, the kitchen, even looked out the back door to see if they were in the yard, but there was no sign of them anywhere. Both their cars were in the driveway though, so they had to be somewhere in the house. Maybe they'd all gone upstairs to look at the photo albums, I thought. Sarah loved looking through my old pictures of Michael when he was little, and the kids enjoyed hearing stories about their daddy as a boy. Or maybe they were all taking a nap. It had been a long week for everyone, and Sunday afternoons were meant for resting. I started up the stairs, calling out softly so I wouldn't wake anyone if they were sleeping. "Michael? Sarah? Where are you kids?" Still no answer. The upstairs hallway was dim and quiet, and I could see that the door to the guest room where I kept all the photo albums was closed. Tommy and Katie's favorite spot when they were here was the big bed in there, where they'd spread out all the pictures and make me tell them the same stories over and over again about their daddy's childhood. I figured that's where I'd find them all, probably looking through the album from Michael's high school graduation or the one from his wedding day. But when I opened that door, the room was empty. Not a soul in sight, everything exactly as I'd left it that morning. That's when I heard it, just the faintest sound coming from down the hall. At first I couldn't place what it was, but as I stood there listening, I realized it was coming from Michael and Sarah's old room, the room that used to be Michael's when he was growing up, the room where Sarah sometimes napped when she visited because the bed was more comfortable than the couch downstairs. I walked toward that door, my footsteps quiet on the old carpet, thinking I'd find them all in there resting. Maybe the kids had fallen asleep and Michael and Sarah were just lying there talking quietly while they slept. My hand was on the doorknob before my brain caught up with what my heart already knew. Something in my chest was telling me not to open that door. Some instinct that had kept me safe through all the hard years was screaming at me to turn around and walk away. But I didn't listen. I turned that knob and pushed open the door, and in that single moment, everything I thought I knew about my life, about my son, about my family, everything I'd built my entire identity around, shattered into a million pieces that I'm still trying to put back together 37 years later. What I saw in that room, I can't describe it to you in detail because some images burn themselves into your mind in ways that words could never capture, but I can tell you that in that single instant, everything I thought I knew about my son died. There was my Michael, my baby boy that I'd raised to be a good man, in bed with his own wife, but it wasn't sweet marital love I was witnessing. It was raw and desperate and wrong in ways that made my stomach turn, because this wasn't the gentle, respectful husband I thought I'd raised. This was a man taking what he wanted without care, without tenderness, and Sarah, my sweet Sarah who I loved like my own daughter, was crying. She was actually crying, and he didn't stop, didn't even seem to care that she was in pain. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, maybe 30, I honestly can't tell you because time stopped working the way it's supposed to. My brain kept trying to make sense of what my eyes were seeing, kept trying to convince me that this was a mistake, that I was misunderstanding something, that my son, the boy I'd given my entire life to raise right, couldn't possibly be hurting this woman that we both loved. But there was no misunderstanding what I was seeing, no way to explain away the sounds Sarah was making, no way to pretend that the look on Michael's face was anything other than selfish and cruel. I backed out of that room as quietly as I'd entered, my hand shaking so badly I could barely pull the door closed, and I stood in that hallway feeling like I was going to vomit or faint or both. My legs were trembling, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest, and I couldn't catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. The woman who'd walked up those stairs was gone, and in her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone whose entire foundation had just been ripped out from under her. What was I supposed to do with what I'd just seen? How do you process the fact that your son, the person you love more than your own life, is capable of such cruelty? How do you reconcile 32 years of believing you raised a good man with the evidence of your own eyes? I thought about marching back in there and demanding an explanation, thought about screaming at him until he understood what he'd just done to our family. I thought about comforting Sarah, about telling her that she didn't have to endure this, about helping her pack her things and take those babies somewhere safe. But then I thought about Tommy and Katie, sweet innocent children who didn't deserve to have their world destroyed because their father was a monster and their grandmother was a coward. I thought about Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday parties, about the life we'd all built together that would be completely destroyed if I opened my mouth. I thought about Sarah's parents, good people who trusted me to take care of their daughter, and how I'd have to look them in the eye and tell them that I'd failed to protect her from my own son. I thought about the gossip that would spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, about how everyone would look at our family with pity and judgment, about how those babies would grow up knowing their father was the kind of man who hurt their mother. And somewhere in the middle of all that thinking, I made a choice that I've regretted every single day since. I decided that maybe, just maybe, if I pretended I hadn't seen anything, if I went back downstairs and acted normal, this nightmare would somehow go away. Maybe it was just a one-time thing. Maybe Michael would realize what he'd done and never do it again. Maybe I could protect everyone by simply forgetting what I'd witnessed. So I tiptoed back down those stairs, my hands still shaking, my heart still pounding, and I started setting the table for Sunday dinner like nothing had happened. I was standing at my kitchen counter, mechanically slicing a loaf of bread that I'd baked the day before, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. My hands were still trembling so badly that I nearly cut myself with the knife, but I kept slicing, kept moving, because if I stopped moving I was going to fall apart completely. I could hear them talking quietly as they came down, Michael's voice low and casual like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just shown me exactly what kind of man I'd raised. I heard the bathroom door close, heard water running, heard Sarah's voice saying something about helping with dinner, and I realized that in about 30 seconds I was going to have to look both of them in the eye and pretend that my entire world hadn't just collapsed. When Michael walked into the kitchen, he looked exactly like he always did after a Sunday nap, hair a little messy, shirt wrinkled, that sleepy smile on his face that used to make my heart melt with motherly pride. "Hey Mom," he said, just like he'd said 1,000 times before, "sorry we're a little early." Sarah was tired and wanted to lie down for a bit before dinner. He kissed my cheek the way he always did, and I had to grip the counter to keep from pulling away from him, had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming at him to never touch me again. "How was church?" he asked, opening the refrigerator and pulling out a beer like this was just another ordinary Sunday, like he hadn't just destroyed everything I thought I knew about him. I heard my own voice answering him, heard myself say Pastor Williams preached about forgiveness today, and the irony of those words hit me like a physical blow. Michael just nodded and took a long drink of his beer, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was dying inside just 3 feet away from him. When Sarah came into the kitchen a few minutes later, I nearly started crying right there on the spot. Her eyes were red and she moved carefully, like someone who'd been hurt, but she smiled at me and asked if there was anything she could do to help with dinner. This sweet girl who'd never done anything wrong in her life, who'd trusted me to keep her safe in my family, and I was about to become part of the lie that would keep her trapped. "Just tired," she said when I asked if she was feeling all right, but I could see the truth in her eyes, could see the pain she was trying to hide. And that's when I made the choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of taking her hand and telling her that what had just happened wasn't her fault, instead of demanding that Michael explain himself, instead of doing what any decent person would do, I smiled and said, "Well, you just sit down and rest. Michael can help me finish up." I became part of the lie in that moment, became complicit in my own son's cruelty, and I've never forgiven myself for it. That Sunday dinner was the longest meal of my life. I set out the good china, the plates with the little blue flowers that my mother had given me for my wedding, and I watched my son and his wife sit at my table like they were actors in some horrible play that I couldn't escape from. Michael carved the roast just like he always did, making jokes about how his mother always cooked enough food for an army, and Sarah helped me bring out the mashed potatoes and green beans, complimenting me on how everything smelled delicious. We were all playing our parts perfectly, 3 people pretending that something unspeakable hadn't just happened upstairs in my house. I kept waiting for one of them to slip up, to say something that would give away what I'd witnessed, but they were both so good at lying that it terrified me. Was this something they'd done before? Had there been other times when I'd been downstairs cooking while my son was upstairs hurting his wife? How long had I been living in this house of lies without knowing it? Every time Michael laughed at his own jokes, every time he reached across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand, every time he asked me to pass the salt or commented on how tender the meat was, I felt like I was going to be sick. This was my son, the baby I'd held in my arms, the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd saved up his lawn mowing money to buy me flowers for Mother's Day. How had I failed so completely? Where had I gone wrong in raising him? What had I missed? What signs had I ignored? What crucial lesson had I failed to teach him about how to treat women, about how to love his wife? Sarah barely ate anything, just pushed food around on her plate and smiled when anyone looked her way, but I could see the effort it took for her to keep up the pretense. She was protecting Michael just like I was, and that realization made me hate myself even more. Here was this young woman, barely 25 years old, carrying the burden of her husband's cruelty and still trying to keep the family together, still trying to spare everyone else the pain of knowing the truth. She was braver than I was, stronger than I was, and she didn't even know that I knew what she was going through. I wanted to reach across that table and take her hand, wanted to tell her that she didn't have to protect him, that she deserved so much better than what my son was giving her. But I didn't. I just sat there and complimented her on how pretty she looked, asked her about her job at the library, made small talk about nothing while my heart was breaking for both of us. The worst part was watching Michael with the children when they finally woke up from their nap and came downstairs. Tommy climbed right up into his daddy's lap, chattering about the dream he'd had about flying airplanes, and Michael listened to every word with such patience and love that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined what I'd seen upstairs. This was the Michael I knew, the gentle father who read bedtime stories and built blanket forts and never raised his voice at his children. When little Katie showed him a picture she'd colored that morning, he praised her artwork like she was the next Picasso, kissing the top of her head and telling her she was the most talented little girl in all of Kentucky. How could the same man who was so tender with his children be so cruel to their mother? How could someone have such capacity for love and such capacity for violence living inside the same heart? As I cleared the dinner dishes and served the apple pie I'd made that morning, I listened to Michael tell stories about his work at the garage, about the old Chevrolet he was restoring in his spare time, about his plans to take the family camping next weekend. He sounded like every other devoted husband and father, like the kind of man any woman would be lucky to have, and I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I hadn't seen what I thought I'd seen. Maybe my headache had affected my vision, maybe I'd misunderstood what was happening, maybe there was some explanation that would make everything make sense again. But then I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and I saw the way she flinched when Michael touched her shoulder, saw the careful way she moved when she got up to help me with dessert, saw the fear that flashed across her face for just a split second when he suggested they should head home soon. No, I hadn't imagined anything. What I'd seen was real, and every minute I sat there pretending otherwise was another minute I was choosing Michael over Sarah, choosing my comfort over her safety, choosing the lie over the truth. The weeks that followed that terrible Sunday were like living in some kind of waking nightmare where I had to smile and nod and pretend that everything was normal while my soul was slowly dying inside. Michael and Sarah came for dinner every Sunday just like they always had, and I cooked their favorite meals and listened to their stories and hugged them goodbye like I was still the same woman who'd raised them both with love and pride. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. That woman had died the moment she opened that bedroom door, and what was left was someone I barely recognized, someone who could lie as easily as breathing, someone who could look her own son in the eye and pretend she didn't know what kind of monster he really was. I became a detective in my own home, watching every interaction between Michael and Sarah with the desperate hope that I'd been wrong, that what I'd seen was somehow an isolated incident that would never happen again. I studied Sarah's face for signs of fresh bruises, listened to the tone of her voice when she spoke to Michael, analyzed every gesture and glance between them for clues about what was really happening in their marriage. Some days I convinced myself that things were getting better, that maybe my son had realized how wrong he'd been and changed his ways. Sarah would laugh at one of his jokes or lean against his shoulder while they sat on my couch, and I'd think that surely no woman could fake that kind of affection, that surely she wouldn't stay with him if he was still hurting her. But then there were other days when I'd catch a look in her eyes, a flinch when he touched her unexpectedly, a careful way she chose her words when he asked her opinion about something, and I'd know that nothing had changed at all. The worst part was how good they both were at pretending, how seamlessly they performed the role of a happy couple for my benefit and for the children's. Michael would bring Sarah flowers for no reason, would compliment her cooking when she helped me prepare meals, would put his arm around her during family photos with such convincing tenderness that anyone watching would think he adored her. And Sarah played her part perfectly too, smiling at his jokes, thanking him for his thoughtfulness, acting like the grateful wife of a devoted husband. I started to wonder if this was how they always were, if their entire marriage was built on this kind of performance, or if the acting was just for me because they suspected I knew something. Did Sarah think I was blind to her suffering, or was she protecting me from the truth the same way I was protecting her from knowing that I knew? Did Michael have any idea that his mother had seen him at his worst, or did he assume he was still the golden boy in my eyes? The not knowing was almost worse than the knowing, because it meant I was constantly second-guessing myself, constantly wondering if I was seeing things that weren't there or missing things that were right in front of me. I started having trouble sleeping, would lie awake at night replaying every conversation we'd had, every look that had passed between them, every moment when Sarah had seemed uncomfortable or Michael had seemed too controlling. I'd get up at 2 in the morning and pace around my kitchen, making lists in my head of all the signs I might have missed over the years, all the times Sarah might have been trying to tell me something without actually saying it. Had she ever tried to confide in me? Had there been moments when she'd started to say something about her marriage but stopped herself? Had I been so blinded by my pride in Michael that I'd missed every cry for help she'd ever made? The guilt was eating me alive, but the fear was even worse. Fear that if I said something, Michael would take the children and disappear, that I'd never see Tommy and Katie again. Fear that if I confronted him, he'd hurt Sarah even worse than he already was. Fear that if I told Sarah what I'd seen, she'd leave him and take the babies with her, and I'd lose the only family I had left. Fear that if I did nothing, Sarah would eventually be seriously injured or worse, and I'd have to live with knowing I could have prevented it. I was trapped between my love for my son and my love for my daughter-in-law, between my desire to protect the children and my need to protect their mother, between the woman I'd always been and the woman I was becoming. Every Sunday dinner became an exercise in torture, sitting at that table and making small talk while my heart was breaking, watching my son be charming and funny and seemingly loving while knowing what he was capable of when no one was watching. I'd find myself studying his hands as he cut his meat, remembering how those same hands had been hurting Sarah just hours before. I'd listen to him tell stories about his work or his plans for the future, and I'd wonder how someone could be so gentle with his words and so violent with his actions. I'd watch him play with Tommy and Katie, being patient and kind and everything a father should be, and I'd feel like I was going insane trying to reconcile the man I was seeing with the man I knew he really was. And through it all, Sarah kept playing the perfect wife, kept bringing casseroles to church potlucks and attending PTA meetings and organizing playdates for the children, kept acting like her life was everything she'd ever wanted. She was so convincing that sometimes I almost believed it myself, almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that my son really was the good man I'd raised him to be. But the facade was slowly killing me from the inside out. I started losing weight because food tasted like ash in my mouth, started making excuses to skip church because I couldn't sit through sermons about truth and righteousness while living such a massive lie. My friends at the textile factory began asking if I was feeling alright, if I needed to see a doctor, because the bags under my eyes were getting darker and my hands had developed a constant tremor that I couldn't control. I told them it was just the stress of getting older, just the normal aches and pains that come with being in your 50s, but the truth was that keeping this secret was literally making me sick. I'd catch myself staring at Michael during those Sunday dinners, searching his face for any sign of guilt or remorse, any indication that he understood the gravity of what he'd done and was trying to make amends. But he seemed completely at peace with himself, completely comfortable with the life he was living, and that terrified me more than anything else. How could someone hurt another person and then sit down to pot roast and mashed potatoes like nothing had happened? How could he kiss his children goodnight and read them bedtime stories and tuck them in with such tenderness, then turn around and be cruel to their mother? The disconnect between the Michael I saw in public and the Michael I'd seen in that bedroom was so extreme that I started to wonder if my son was actually mentally ill, if there was something seriously wrong with his brain that made him capable of such Jekyll and Hyde behavior. I thought about approaching his childhood pediatrician, Dr. Hendricks, and asking if there had ever been any signs of psychological problems when Michael was young. I thought about researching books about domestic violence at the library, but I was too afraid that Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, would ask questions about why Dorothy Thompson was suddenly interested in such dark topics. I even considered calling one of those anonymous hotlines they advertised on television, just to talk to someone who might be able to help me understand what I was dealing with, but I could never bring myself to pick up the phone. What would I say? That I was a 60-year-old grandmother who'd discovered that her son was abusing his wife but was too much of a coward to do anything about it? That I was more concerned about maintaining my family's reputation than protecting an innocent woman from being hurt? That I cared more about my own comfort than I did about doing what was right? The shame of admitting all of that out loud was more than I could bear. So I kept watching and waiting and hoping that somehow, miraculously, the situation would resolve itself without me having to make any difficult choices. I told myself that maybe Sarah was stronger than I thought, that maybe she'd find the courage to leave Michael on her own. I told myself that maybe Michael would realize what he was doing was wrong and stop on his own. I told myself that maybe if I just prayed hard enough, God would intervene and fix everything without requiring me to get my hands dirty. But deep down, I knew I was just making excuses, just trying to justify my own cowardice. I knew that every day I stayed silent was another day I was failing Sarah, another day I was choosing my own peace of mind over her safety. And the worst part was that I was starting to see the toll this was taking on the children too. Tommy, who'd always been such a happy, outgoing little boy, was becoming more clingy and anxious, constantly asking if Mommy was okay, if Daddy was mad about something. Katie had started having nightmares and wetting the bed, behaviors she'd outgrown years earlier. They could sense that something was wrong in their family, even if they couldn't understand what it was, and I was watching my precious grandchildren suffer because I didn't have the courage to speak up for their mother. Every night I'd lie in bed and promise myself that tomorrow would be the day I'd finally do something, that I'd find a way to help Sarah without destroying everything else. But then morning would come, and Michael would call to check on me like the devoted son he appeared to be, or Sarah would stop by with the children and act like everything was fine, and I'd convince myself that maybe things weren't as bad as I thought they were. Maybe I was overreacting, maybe what I'd seen wasn't as serious as it had seemed, maybe I should just mind my own business and let them work out their marriage problems in private. 3 months after that terrible Sunday, Sarah came to my house alone on a Tuesday afternoon while the children were at school. I was in my garden pulling weeds when I heard her car pull up, and when I looked up and saw her walking toward me with tears in her eyes, my heart nearly stopped. She looked thinner than she had in weeks, more fragile, and there was something desperate in the way she was wringing her hands that told me she'd finally reached her breaking point. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, and her voice was shaking so badly she could barely get the words out, "I need to talk to someone, and I don't know who else to turn to." I wiped the dirt off my hands and led her to the porch swing where we'd sat so many times before, talking about the children, about recipes, about all the normal things that mothers and daughters-in-law discuss. But this wasn't going to be a normal conversation, and we both knew it. Sarah sat down next to me and burst into tears, the kind of tears that come from months of holding everything inside, and she said the words that nearly broke me completely. "I think Michael is having an affair." She looked at me with such trust, such desperate hope that I'd be able to help her make sense of what was happening to her marriage, and I felt like the worst person who'd ever lived. Here was this sweet girl, asking me to help her understand why her husband was acting strange, why he seemed angry all the time, why their relationship felt so different lately. She didn't know that her mother-in-law had witnessed the truth, that the woman she was turning to for comfort and advice was already carrying the very secret that was destroying her life. "He's been so distant," she whispered, "so cold. And sometimes he looks at me like he hates me, like I've done something terrible and he can't forgive me for it. I keep trying to figure out what I did wrong, but I can't think of anything." The irony was so cruel it took my breath away. Sarah thought Michael was cheating on her with another woman, when the truth was so much worse than that. She was blaming herself for his behavior, wondering what she'd done to make him stop loving her, when what she should have been doing was running as far away from him as possible. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and he's just staring at me, she continued, her voice getting smaller and more frightened. Not looking at me with love, but staring like he's angry about something I don't even know I did. And when I ask him what's wrong, he tells me I'm being paranoid, that I'm imagining things. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara on her cheeks that made her look even younger and more vulnerable than she already was. Last week I found a receipt in his pocket from a restaurant I've never been to, and when I asked him about it, he got so mad he threw a plate across the kitchen. It shattered against the wall right next to where Katie was sitting, and she started crying, and he just walked out of the house without saying a word. This was information I didn't have, evidence that Michael's behavior was escalating, that his violence wasn't limited to what happened in their bedroom. The thought of him throwing dishes around those precious children made my blood run cold, but it also made me realize that I'd been naive to think this was something that would just go away on its own. I called my sister in Louisville, Sarah said, and she told me I should hire a private investigator, find out where he's going, who he's seeing. But Mrs. Thompson, I don't want to know if there's another woman. I don't want proof that my marriage is over, that my children are going to grow up in a broken home. I just want things to go back to the way they were before, when Michael was happy and we were a real family. She looked at me with such hope, such trust, and I realized that this moment was a test. This was my chance to tell her the truth, to finally do the right thing and give her the information she needed to protect herself and those children. The words were right there on the tip of my tongue, ready to spill out and finally give her the truth she deserved to know. I could tell her that there was no other woman, that the problem wasn't infidelity but something much darker and more dangerous. I could warn her that Michael's anger was escalating, that the plate he'd thrown could just as easily have been thrown at her or one of the children. I could give her the evidence she needed to leave him, to take Tommy and Katie somewhere safe, to build a new life away from the man who was slowly destroying them all. But instead, I heard myself saying, "Oh honey, I'm sure you're just imagining things. Michael loves you so much. He's probably just stressed about work, you know how men get when they're worried about providing for their families." I watched the hope drain out of her eyes as I spoke, watched her shoulders slump with disappointment and defeat. She'd come to me looking for validation, for someone to confirm that her instincts were right, that something was seriously wrong in her marriage. Instead, I'd just done what everyone else in her life was probably doing, dismissed her concerns and made her feel like she was crazy for being afraid. "Maybe you're right," she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice, could see that she didn't believe me any more than I believed myself. "Maybe I am just being paranoid." She stayed for another hour, and we talked about safe things, normal things, grandmother things like what costumes the children wanted for Halloween and whether Katie was ready to start piano lessons. But underneath all that ordinary conversation, I could feel the weight of what I hadn't said, the terrible burden of the truth I was carrying alone. After Sarah left that day, I sat on that porch swing for 2 hours staring at nothing, feeling like I'd just committed the worst sin of my life by lying to that poor girl when she needed the truth more than she needed air to breathe. I'd looked into her desperate, frightened eyes and I'd chosen my son over her, chosen my own comfort over her safety, chosen the lie that kept our family together over the truth that might have saved her life. That night I couldn't eat the chicken and dumplings I'd made for dinner, couldn't even look at the food without feeling sick to my stomach, so I threw it all away and went to bed hungry, which seemed like appropriate punishment for what I'd become. But sleep wouldn't come, no matter how exhausted I was, no matter how badly my body ached from the stress I was carrying. I'd lie there in the dark listening to every sound the old house made, every creak and settle and whisper of wine through the trees, and I'd replay that conversation with Sarah over and over again until I thought I was going to lose my mind completely. I should have told her the truth, should have taken her hands in mine and explained exactly what I'd seen that terrible Sunday, should have helped her pack her things and find somewhere safe for her and those babies to go. Instead, I'd sent her back to Michael with my blessing, had essentially told her that whatever she was feeling, whatever instincts were telling her to be afraid, she should ignore them because her mother-in-law didn't think there was anything to worry about. How could I call myself a woman, call myself a mother, call myself someone who cared about other people, when I'd just fed a victim back to her predator with my own hands? The sleepless nights turned into sleepless weeks, and I started losing weight because food tasted like cardboard and my stomach was always churning with anxiety and guilt. My friends at work noticed, started asking if I was feeling alright, if I needed to see a doctor about the dark circles under my eyes and the way my hands had started shaking all the time. I told them it was just the change of life, just hormones, and getting older, but the truth was that keeping this secret was killing me slowly from the inside out. I'd catch myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering who this hollow-eyed stranger was, wondering when I'd become the kind of person who could watch evil happen and do nothing to stop it. I started avoiding church because I couldn't sit through sermons about love and forgiveness and doing what's right when I was living such a massive lie. I made excuses about not feeling well, about having to work extra shifts, about needing to stay home and clean house, but the real reason was that I couldn't face Pastor Williams when he talked about our responsibility to protect the innocent and speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. I was terrified that everyone in that sanctuary could see the guilt written all over my face, could tell just by looking at me that I was harboring a terrible secret that was eating me alive. The worst part was watching Tommy and Katie when they came for their Sunday visits, seeing how their little faces lit up when they saw their grandma Dorothy, how they ran to me with such trust and love and pure joy. They'd climb into my lap and chatter about school and friends and whatever cartoon they'd watched that morning, and I'd hold them close and breathe in that sweet smell of childhood innocence while my heart was breaking because I knew I was failing them. These precious babies were growing up in a house where their father hurt their mother, where violence and fear were becoming normal parts of their daily lives, and I was doing nothing to protect them from that reality. Tommy had started asking questions that scared me, questions like why Mommy seemed sad all the time and why Daddy got so angry when she dropped things or forgot where she'd put something. Katie had developed a stutter that she'd never had before, and she'd started wetting the bed again even though she'd been potty trained for over a year. These children were showing signs of trauma, clear evidence that something was seriously wrong in their home environment, and I was the only adult in their lives who knew exactly what that something was. I could have been their hero, could have been the grandmother who saved them from growing up thinking that it was normal for fathers to hurt mothers, that it was acceptable for men to be violent when they were angry or frustrated. Instead, I was becoming part of the system that was damaging them, part of the conspiracy of silence that was teaching them to normalize abuse and accept the unacceptable. Michael started noticing that something was different about me too, started commenting on how quiet I'd become, how distracted I seemed during our conversations. "Are you feeling all right, Mom?" he'd ask, and there was something in his voice that made me wonder if he suspected I knew something. "You seem different lately, kind of distant. Is there something bothering you?" The irony of my son asking me if something was bothering me, when he was the very thing that was destroying my peace of mind, was almost too much to bear. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he understood what he'd done to our family, what he was continuing to do every single day that he chose violence over love. But instead I'd make excuses about being tired from work, about getting older and not sleeping as well as I used to, about having a lot on my mind with bills and household repairs and all the normal concerns of a woman my age. He'd nod and seem satisfied with these explanations, but I could tell he was watching me more carefully, paying attention to my moods and my behavior in ways that made me nervous. Was he worried that I'd found out about his true nature? Was he concerned that Sarah had confided in me about her suspicions? Or was he just a loving son who was genuinely concerned about his mother's health and well-being? I couldn't tell anymore, couldn't read him the way I used to when he was just my little boy, and I knew every expression on his face, every tone in his voice. The man sitting across from me at my dinner table was a stranger wearing my son's face, and I didn't know what he was capable of if he ever discovered that I'd seen him at his worst. There were moments when I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, moments when our eyes would meet across the room and I'd feel a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Was he trying to figure out what I knew? Was he planning what he'd do if I ever became a threat to the life he'd built, the reputation he'd carefully maintained? I started to understand why Sarah was so afraid all the time, why she moved so carefully around him, why she chose her words so precisely when she spoke to him. Living with someone who could switch from loving to violent without warning was like walking through a minefield blindfolded, never knowing which step might trigger an explosion. And now I was living in that same minefield, tiptoeing around the truth, terrified that one wrong word or look or gesture might reveal that I knew exactly what kind of man my son really was. The woman I'd been before that terrible Sunday, the woman who'd believed in the power of love to overcome anything, who'd trusted in the goodness of the people she'd raised, who'd thought she understood what family meant and what loyalty required, that woman was disappearing a little more each day. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who could lie without blinking, someone who could choose convenience over conscience, someone who could watch a victim suffer and call it keeping the peace. It was a rainy Thursday evening in October, almost 4 months after I'd walked in on that nightmare, when Michael showed up at my house unannounced. I was in the kitchen washing dishes from my solitary dinner when I heard his truck pull into the driveway, heard his heavy footsteps on the front porch, heard his key in the lock like he still lived there and had every right to come and go as he pleased. "Mom," he called out, and there was something different in his voice, something that made me freeze with my hands still in the soapy water. "We need to talk." I dried my hands on the dish towel, my heart already starting to pound because I could tell from his tone that this wasn't going to be one of our usual conversations about work or the weather or what the kids were doing in school. This was going to be something serious, something that had been building for weeks, and I had a terrible feeling that my months of trying to act normal had finally failed me. When I walked into the living room, Michael was standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed, and the look on his face was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't the gentle expression of the son who used to tell me about his day while I cooked dinner, wasn't the loving smile of the young man who'd brought Sarah home to meet me all those years ago. This was the face of someone who was angry and suspicious and maybe even a little dangerous, and seeing it directed at me made my blood run cold. "Sit down, Mom," he said, and it wasn't a request. "There's something we need to discuss." I sat down in my usual chair, the same chair where I'd rocked him to sleep when he was a baby, where I'd helped him with homework when he was in school, where I'd listened to all his hopes and dreams and fears throughout his childhood. But now I felt like a stranger in my own home, like I was facing an interrogation from someone who might hurt me if I gave the wrong answers. "Sarah thinks I'm having an affair," he said, getting straight to the point in a way that made my stomach drop to my feet. "She's been acting paranoid and suspicious for months, asking me questions about where I've been and who I've been with, going through my pockets and checking my phone when she thinks I'm not paying attention." He started pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and I could see the anger building in him like steam in a pressure cooker. "And you know what the really interesting thing is, Mom? She told me that you were the one who convinced her she was imagining things, that you assured her I would never cheat on her because I love her so much." The way he said those last words, with such sarcasm and contempt, made me realize that he knew I'd been lying to Sarah, that he understood exactly what game I'd been playing and why. "But here's what I can't figure out," he continued, stopping directly in front of my chair and staring down at me with those dark eyes that used to be so full of love and now looked cold as winter. "If you really believed what you told her, if you really thought I was just a devoted husband going through a rough patch, then why have you been acting like you're afraid of me?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun, and I could feel my carefully constructed facade starting to crumble around me. For months I'd been telling myself that I was protecting everyone by keeping quiet, that I was being strong and noble by carrying this burden alone. But now, sitting here under my son's accusing stare, I realized that I'd just been a coward, too weak to face the truth and too selfish to do what was right. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but my voice came out shaky and unconvincing, and we both knew I was lying. I've been the same as I always am. Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Really, Mom? Because Sarah isn't the only one who's been acting strange lately. You think I haven't noticed how different you've been? How you can barely look me in the eye anymore? How you flinch when I touch you, how you make excuses to cut our visits short, how you've stopped asking me about my life. He leaned down so his face was just inches from mine, and I could smell the anger on him like a physical presence. You think I haven't noticed that you look at me like you're scared of me now, like you think I'm some kind of monster? The word monster hit me like a slap across the face, because that's exactly what I did think he was, exactly what I'd been too afraid to say out loud even to myself. But hearing him use that word, hearing the challenge in his voice, something inside me finally snapped. All the months of carrying this secret, all the sleepless nights and the guilt and the fear, all the times I'd wanted to scream the truth but held it back, everything came boiling up out of me at once. Maybe because you are a monster, I heard myself say, and the words seemed to echo in the quiet room like a gunshot. Maybe because I know exactly what kind of man you really are, what you do to that poor girl when you think nobody's watching. Michael's face went completely white, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who'd been caught stealing cookies from the jar, shocked and guilty and terrified all at once. But then the mask slipped back into place, and he straightened up and crossed his arms again, trying to regain control of the situation. I don't know what you think you know, he said, but his voice wasn't quite as steady as it had been before. But whatever crazy ideas you've gotten into your head, you need to forget them right now. That's when I stood up from my chair, stood up and looked my son in the eye for the first time in months, and I felt something powerful and terrible rising up in my chest. I saw you. I screamed, and the sound of my own voice surprised me with its fury, its pain, its complete devastation. I saw you that Sunday when I came home early from church with a headache. I saw you in that bedroom with Sarah, and it wasn't love, Michael. It wasn't a husband making love to his wife. It was you hurting her, you taking what you wanted without caring that she was crying, without caring that she was in pain. The words came pouring out of me like blood from a wound, months of suppressed truth finally finding their voice. I saw the real you, the you that nobody else gets to see, and I've been living with that image in my head every single day since then. I've been sitting at my dinner table looking at you and wondering how I raised such a cruel man, how I failed so completely that my own son could hurt an innocent woman and feel no shame about it. Michael's face had gone from white to red, and I could see the veins in his neck standing out like ropes. You don't understand, he said, but his voice was defensive now, desperate. Sarah can be difficult, she doesn't always listen, she needs firm guidance sometimes. Firm guidance? I laughed, and it was a terrible sound, full of bitterness and disbelief. Is that what you call it when you throw plates at the wall next to your daughter's head? Is that what you call it when you make your wife so afraid that she comes to me asking if you're having an affair because she can't understand why you look at her with such hatred? I saw him flinch when I mentioned the plate, saw the guilt flash across his features before he could hide it, and I knew that Sarah had been telling me the truth about everything. You want to know why she thinks you're cheating? Because she can't imagine that the man she married, the man she trusted with her heart and her body and her children, could be capable of what you're really doing to her. She's trying to find an explanation that makes sense, because the truth is too horrible for her to accept. Tears were streaming down my face now, months of grief and rage and disappointment finally finding their release. I gave my whole life to raising you, Michael. I sacrificed everything to make sure you grew up knowing right from wrong, knowing how to treat women with respect, knowing what it meant to be a good man. And you've thrown it all away, thrown away everything I taught you, everything your father would have wanted you to be. I could see him struggling with what to say, could see the boy I'd raised warring with the man he'd become, and for just a moment I hoped that maybe this confrontation would be the wake-up call he needed. Maybe hearing the truth spoken out loud would shock him back to his senses. But then his face hardened again, and I knew that my son, the child I'd loved more than my own life, was truly lost to me forever. "If you ever say anything like this to anyone," he said, and his voice was quiet now but full of menace, "if you ever try to interfere in my marriage or turn Sarah against me, you'll never see those children again. Do you understand me, Mom? Never." And with that threat hanging in the air between us, he turned and walked out of my house, leaving me standing alone in my living room with the terrible knowledge that I'd just lost my son forever, and I still hadn't done anything to save Sarah. After Michael left that night, I stood in my living room for what felt like hours, staring at the door he'd slammed behind him, trying to process what had just happened between us. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved more than my own life, had just threatened me in my own home, had looked me in the eye and told me that if I tried to protect his wife from his cruelty, he'd make sure I never saw my grandchildren again. And the most devastating part wasn't the threat itself, it was the cold, calculating way he'd delivered it, like he'd been planning exactly what he'd say if this moment ever came. This wasn't the heat of the moment anger of someone who'd been caught doing something wrong. This was the calculated response of someone who'd already thought through all the possible scenarios and knew exactly how to maintain control. That's when I realized that my son hadn't just made a few terrible mistakes, hadn't just lost his temper or struggled with marital problems like I'd been trying to convince myself. This was who he really was, who he'd probably always been underneath the charming facade he showed to the world. The little boy who'd brought me flowers and told me he loved me every night before bed, the teenager who'd worked after school to help with the bills, the young man who'd seemed so devoted to Sarah and the children, all of that had been a performance designed to keep everyone around him believing he was a good person. And I'd been the most devoted member of his audience, the one person who'd believed in his goodness so completely that I'd ignored every sign that something was wrong, every instinct that told me the man I was seeing didn't match the man I thought I'd raised. The weeks that followed our confrontation were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Michael didn't come for Sunday dinner the next week, or the week after that, or the week after that. When I called their house, Sarah would answer and make polite excuses about Michael working late or the family having other plans, but I could hear the confusion in her voice, could tell she didn't understand why the weekly tradition that had been such an important part of our lives had suddenly ended. "Is everything all right between you and Michael?" she asked me during one of these awkward phone conversations. "He's been acting strange lately, even stranger than before, and when I ask him about visiting you, he just says he's too busy. Did you two have some kind of argument?" I wanted so badly to tell her the truth, to explain that her husband had revealed his true nature and threatened his own mother to keep her quiet about it. I wanted to warn her that whatever she thought she knew about Michael, she was only seeing the surface, that underneath his carefully maintained exterior was someone capable of violence and intimidation and emotional manipulation. But his threat hung over me like a sword, the knowledge that if I said one word about what I knew, I'd lose Tommy and Katie forever. So I lied to Sarah again, told her that Michael and I had just had a minor disagreement about something silly, that I was sure it would blow over soon and everything would go back to normal. But I knew it never would. My son was dead to me now, not in the literal sense, but in every way that mattered. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd thought he'd become, had never really existed at all. What remained was just a stranger wearing his face, someone who looked like Michael and sounded like Michael but was really just a predator who'd learned to mimic human decency well enough to fool the people around him. I started seeing him around town sometimes, at the grocery store or the gas station or coming out of the bank, and he'd nod politely like we were acquaintances who didn't know each other very well. No warmth, no recognition of the 33 years I'd spent loving him and caring for him and believing in him. He'd become exactly what he'd threatened to become, a man who could cut his own mother out of his life without a second thought if she became inconvenient to him. The hardest part was when I'd see him with the children, when I'd catch glimpses of him picking them up from school or taking them to the park. Tommy and Katie would wave at me from across the street or call out "Hi Grandma" when they saw me, but Michael would hurry them along before they could run over to hug me like they used to do. I could see the confusion on their little faces, could tell they didn't understand why Grandma Dorothy wasn't part of their lives anymore, why Daddy didn't want them spending time with the woman who'd loved them since the day they were born. And I knew that Michael was probably telling them lies about me, probably painting me as the villain in this story, probably making sure they understood that if they wanted to see me, they had to do it secretly, behind his back. He was using my own grandchildren as weapons against me, turning them into pawns in a game I didn't even want to play. The man I'd thought was my son would never have done something so cruel, would never have punished innocent children for their grandmother's supposed sins. But this man, this stranger who shared Michael's DNA but none of his heart, was capable of anything. The months that followed Michael's threat stretched out like the longest winter of my life, cold and gray and seemingly endless. I'd wake up every morning in the same house where I'd raised him, where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and helped him with his homework and listened to all his childhood dreams, and I'd feel like I was living in a museum dedicated to a life that had never really existed. Every photograph on my mantelpiece, every memory I'd treasured, every story I'd told myself about what a good mother I'd been, all of it felt like lies now. I'd been so proud of the man I thought I'd raised, so convinced that love and dedication could overcome any obstacle, that a mother's devotion could shape a child's character and guarantee their goodness. But now I understood that I'd been naive, that there are some things in human nature that no amount of love can fix, some darkness that exists independent of how well a child is raised or how much they're cherished. Michael's true nature hadn't been something I'd failed to prevent, it had been something I'd failed to see. The isolation was the hardest part to bear, harder even than the guilt and the grief and the constant worry about Sarah and the children. For 33 years, Michael had been the center of my universe, the person I talked to about everything, the reason I got up in the morning and the source of all my pride and joy. Now I had no one to share my thoughts with, no one who would understand the magnitude of what I'd lost, no one who could help me make sense of how completely my life had been turned upside down. I couldn't tell my friends at work about what had happened because they'd known Michael since he was a little boy, had watched him grow up and marry Sarah and start his family, and they thought he was wonderful. How could I explain to Mary Henderson or Betty Lou Watson that the young man they'd seen helping me carry groceries and fixing my broken porch steps was actually a monster who hurt his wife and threatened his own mother? They'd think I'd lost my mind, or worse, they'd think I was a terrible person for saying such awful things about my own son. I couldn't talk to Pastor Williams because Michael and Sarah still attended our church every Sunday, still sat in the third pew from the front with the children between them, still looked like the perfect Christian family that everyone admired. If I tried to tell Pastor Williams what I knew, it would just be my word against Michael's, and Michael was so much better at lying than I'd ever realized. He'd convinced an entire community that he was a good man, had built a reputation for kindness and reliability and devotion to his family that would be impossible to tear down with my unsupported accusations. So I carried the weight of this knowledge alone, and it was slowly crushing me from the inside out. I'd lost 20 pounds since that terrible confrontation, had developed chronic insomnia that left me exhausted and hollow-eyed, had started having panic attacks whenever I heard a truck that sounded like Michael's pulling into the driveway. My doctor wanted to prescribe antidepressants, but how could I explain that my depression wasn't chemical? It was the natural result of discovering that everything I'd believed about my life had been a lie. I still saw Sarah occasionally, brief encounters at the grocery store or the post office where we'd exchange polite pleasantries and she'd show me pictures of the children, but these conversations were torture for both of us. She could tell that something fundamental had changed between our families, could sense that there was some secret she wasn't being told, but she was too polite to press me for details when I clearly didn't want to discuss it. And I could see that she was getting thinner, more nervous, more careful in the way she moved and spoke, signs that Michael's behavior at home was continuing to escalate. There were bruises sometimes, barely visible marks on her wrists or her collarbone that she tried to hide with long sleeves and high-necked blouses, and every time I saw evidence of his violence I felt like an accomplice to her suffering. I was the one person who could have warned her, could have given her the information she needed to protect herself, and instead I was letting her face this nightmare alone because I was too afraid of losing my grandchildren to do what was right. The worst moments came when I'd catch glimpses of Tommy and Katie around town, usually when Michael wasn't with them, and they'd run up to me with such joy and excitement, chattering about school and friends and whatever toys they were playing with lately. "Why don't you come to dinner anymore, Grandma?" Katie asked me once when we encountered each other at the library, her little face scrunched up with confusion. "Daddy says you're too busy, but I miss you." I had to excuse myself and go cry in the bathroom, because how do you explain to a 5-year-old that her father is a monster and her grandmother is a coward? How do you tell a child that the family she thought was safe and stable and loving is actually built on lies and violence and threats? These brief encounters with my grandchildren were both a blessing and a curse, moments of pure love and connection followed immediately by the devastating reminder that I was choosing my own comfort over their well-being, that every day I stayed silent was another day I was failing the people I claimed to love most. 5 years passed before I saw any sign that maybe, just maybe, some small part of the son I'd raised still existed somewhere inside the man Michael had become. 5 long years of carrying this secret alone, of watching Sarah grow thinner and more fragile from a distance, of catching glimpses of my grandchildren around town and feeling my heart break a little more each time I saw how much they'd grown without me. Tommy was 9 now, Katie was 7, and they'd stopped asking their friends about why Grandma Dorothy didn't come to family dinners anymore. They'd accepted, the way children do, that this was just how life was now, that families sometimes fell apart for reasons nobody could explain to them. I was 69 years old by then, officially retired from the textile factory and spending my days tending to my garden and trying to find ways to fill the empty hours that used to be occupied by loving my family. I'd become one of those women you see at the grocery store buying single-serving portions of everything, living a small, quiet life that nobody paid much attention to. But I still lived in Cedar Falls, still drove the same streets and shopped in the same stores, so it was inevitable that I'd occasionally see Michael and his family from a distance. Most of the time these encounters were painful reminders of everything I'd lost, brief glimpses of the life I used to be part of before I knew the truth about who my son really was. But one afternoon in late September, I saw something that made me pull my car over to the side of the road and sit there with tears streaming down my face. I was driving past Riverside Park, the same park where I'd pushed Michael on the swings when he was Tommy's age, where I'd taught him to ride his bicycle and cheered when he made his first home run in Little League. There was a father and son playing catch on the baseball field, and something about the way they moved together made me look closer. It was Michael and Tommy, and they were having the kind of lazy autumn afternoon that I remembered from my own childhood with my father, just throwing a baseball back and forth and talking about nothing in particular. But what struck me wasn't just that they were playing together, it was the way Michael was interacting with his son. There was a patience in his movements, a gentleness in his voice that I could hear even from across the park, a quality of attention that reminded me of the best parts of the man I'd thought he was. When Tommy missed an easy catch and the ball rolled toward the fence, I expected Michael to show irritation, maybe snap at the boy for not paying attention the way I'd seen him do with Sarah so many times. Instead, he jogged after the ball himself and came back with a smile, saying something that made Tommy laugh and relax his shoulders. They spent almost an hour out there, and during that entire time I didn't see a single moment of impatience or anger or the cold cruelty that I knew Michael was capable of. He was teaching Tommy how to throw a curveball, how to position his feet when he was batting, how to watch the ball all the way into his glove, and he was doing it with the kind of loving attention that every child deserves from their father. When they finally packed up their equipment and headed toward the parking lot, Michael put his arm around Tommy's shoulders and I could see them talking and laughing together like best friends. There was something different about Michael in that moment, something that reminded me of the little boy who used to help me bake cookies for church potlucks and sit with me on the front porch swing telling me about his day. Maybe it was just that being a father had awakened some protective instinct in him that was stronger than his capacity for cruelty. Maybe having children of his own had made him understand, in some small way, what it meant to love someone more than yourself and want to protect them from all the darkness in the world. I started paying attention after that, started watching for other signs that maybe Michael was capable of growth, Maybe the confrontation we'd had years earlier had planted some seed of self-awareness that was finally beginning to sprout. I'd see him at Tommy's baseball games, cheering from the sidelines with genuine pride and enthusiasm. I'd watch him help Katie with her bicycle when the chain came off, kneeling down on the sidewalk in his good work clothes and taking the time to show her how to fix it herself. I'd observe him at the grocery store, patiently letting the children pick out cereal while other parents rushed their kids through the aisles with barely contained irritation. These glimpses didn't erase what I knew about him, didn't change the fact that he'd hurt Sarah and threatened me and destroyed our family's foundation of trust and love. But they did give me something I hadn't had in 5 years, hope that maybe the pain we'd all endured had served some purpose, that maybe losing his mother and nearly losing his wife had forced him to confront the worst parts of himself and try to become better. Maybe the children would grow up with a father who'd learned from his mistakes, who'd chosen to break the cycle of violence instead of perpetuating it. Maybe somewhere in the wreckage of everything I'd lost, there was something worth saving after all. And now here I am, 37 years later, still making my morning coffee in this same kitchen, still looking down that hallway toward the stairs where everything changed. I'm 81 years old now, and my hands shake a little when I pour the cream, not from fear anymore but just from the simple fact of getting older, of having lived long enough to understand that some stories don't have clean endings, that some wounds never fully heal but somehow we learn to carry them with grace. The ring on my finger, my husband James's wedding band that I've worn since the day they brought me that folded flag, still catches the morning light the same way it did all those years ago when I was a young widow trying to raise a son alone. But I don't turn it nervously anymore when I think about Michael. I've made my peace with the choices I made, with the silence I chose, with the terrible knowledge I carried so that 2 innocent children could grow up believing their family was normal and safe and loving. Tommy is 25 now, graduated from college with a degree in engineering, married to a sweet girl named Rebecca who reminds me so much of Sarah at that age. He calls me every few weeks, stops by when he's in town visiting his parents, brings his new wife to meet the grandmother he remembers fondly from his childhood. He doesn't know why there was a period when he barely saw me, doesn't remember the years when family dinners stopped and Grandma Dorothy seemed to disappear from their lives. Children have a way of accepting what adults tell them, of adjusting to new realities without asking too many questions, and maybe that's a blessing. Katie is 23, working as a teacher at the elementary school here in Cedar Falls, living in a little apartment downtown with 2 cats and dreams of someday having a family of her own. She stops by more often than Tommy does, brings me flowers from her garden and sits on this same porch swing where her mother once cried and told me she thought her husband was having an affair. Katie has never been married, says she's waiting for the right man, someone who will treat her with respect and kindness and genuine love. When she talks about what she wants in a husband, I hear something in her voice that gives me hope, a strength and self-awareness that tells me whatever she witnessed in her childhood, whatever trauma she absorbed from living in a house where violence was normal, it didn't break her spirit or convince her that she deserved anything less than real love. Sarah left Michael 8 years ago, finally found the courage to take the children and start over in Louisville where her sister lives. I don't know what finally gave her the strength to leave, whether Michael's behavior escalated to the point where she feared for her life or whether she simply reached the end of her capacity to endure his cruelty. But she did it, she got out, and from what I hear through the small-town gossip network, she's built a good life for herself. She works as a librarian, lives in a little house with a garden, has found some measure of peace after all those years of walking on eggshells. Michael still lives here in Cedar Falls, still runs his garage, still goes to church every Sunday and maintains the facade of being a good man. We've spoken exactly 3 times since that night he threatened me, brief encounters at funerals or community events where politeness required some acknowledgement of our shared history. He treats me like a distant relative, someone he's obligated to be civil to but doesn't particularly like. And that's fine with me, because I know who he really is underneath that mask of respectability, and I know that the children I loved more than my own life grew up to be good people despite him, not because of him. I've learned something about secrets in these 37 years, something I never understood when I was younger and thought the world was simpler than it really is. Some secrets we keep because we're weak, because we're too afraid or too selfish to face the consequences of telling the truth. But other secrets, the hardest ones to carry, we keep because we're strong enough to bear the weight of hell so that the people we love can live in something that looks like heaven, even if it's built on lies. I'll never know if I made the right choice that day when I walked in on Michael and Sarah, when I had the power to change everything and chose silence instead. Maybe if I'd spoken up immediately, if I'd found the courage to tell Sarah what I'd seen and helped her leave him then, she would have been spared years of suffering. Maybe those beautiful children would have grown up in a home filled with real love instead of carefully maintained pretense. Or maybe everything would have been worse, maybe Michael would have taken them and disappeared, maybe the truth would have destroyed them all in ways I can't even imagine. I'll carry that uncertainty with me until the day I die, along with the image of that door creaking open and the moment everything I thought I knew about my life shattered into pieces. But I'll also carry the knowledge that Tommy and Katie grew up to be good, strong people who know how to love and be loved, who understand their own worth and won't settle for anything less than they deserve. Maybe that's enough. Maybe sometimes protecting innocence is worth more than pursuing justice. Maybe sometimes love means carrying darkness so others can walk in light. I'm not asking you to agree with the choices I made, I'm not even sure I agree with them myself. But I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand that mothers, real mothers, don't just love their children when it's easy or convenient or when those children deserve it. We love them through their worst moments, through their biggest failures, through the times when loving them breaks our hearts and costs us everything we thought we wanted for ourselves. And sometimes, when the world forces us to choose between different kinds of love, between different kinds of loyalty, between different kinds of sacrifice, we do the best we can with impossible choices and we live with the consequences. That's what mothers do. That's what love really means. If this story touched something in your heart, if it made you think about the secrets you carry or the choices you've made, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories from an old woman who's learned that life is complicated and love is messy and sometimes the hardest thing we can do is forgive ourselves for being human, well, I'll be right here in this kitchen making my morning coffee, ready to tell you about the other times my heart got broken and somehow kept beating anyway.